The Southborough Library is very happy to welcome author Stephen Puleo. Mr. Puleo is an author, historian, teacher, public speaker, and communications professional. He has written 5 narrative nonfiction books, including Dark Tide. His newest title, American Treasures, was published in August 2016. Please join me in welcoming author Stephen Puleo.
Thank you, folks. Appreciate being here. So American Treasures, just to be clear, is my 6th book. I want you guys to all know that. Very excited about that. Thrilled to be here in Southborough. I've just talking to a friend of mine. I've been to Holliston, Northborough, Hopkinton, but I've never spoken in Southborough. So thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Yes. Your library is very, very pretty. I got a chance to walk around, and that front room is beautiful. I noticed the front room is, according to Ryan, built in 1911. This room with the drop ceiling is like 1980, right, or 1982. So the front room was the place to be for me. I'm just saying it was really nice to be there to do the research. So wanted you guys to know that. This book, American Treasures, I just launched it in late August, so the 1st of September. Call it Labor Day. Very excited about the book. It's called. Its subtitle is "The Secret Efforts to Save the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address." And so far, we're off to a good start launch-wise. Some really good reviews I'm very happy with in Parade Magazine, New York Post, different kinds of radio interviews. I've done both NPR and Breitbart, so I do the liberal and conservative side. During an election year, seems kind of appropriate to do both, which has been terrific. So all of that has gone great. I have speaking engagements coming up at the National Archives. Very exciting for me. It'll be a first for me. So appropriate because the original Declaration and the original Constitution, of course, are there. And I did a lot of research there, so that's really fun. And then on Bill of Rights Day, December 15th, I'll be in Philadelphia speaking at the National Constitution Museum. Also very exciting for me. So all of that's great. And then many local events, including this one, which is terrific. This is my 2nd event. So I launched last week in Hull, Massachusetts, right on the Nantasket Beach at the Nantasket Beach Resort, which is a great place to be, and it was a great place to launch the book. And this is my 2nd live event in the midst of the radio stuff and the newspaper stuff and things like that. So gives you a little bit about how things are going so far. I thought tonight I'd tell you a little bit about the book, the story, pretty fascinating story. These documents are amazing documents. So I have a few things to say, but then we'll get to your questions at the end. I'll have you home in time for the Patriots game to begin the Jacoby Brissett era tonight. I, of course, will miss the first quarter because of the monumental drive back to Weymouth. So I'll be listening on the radio and get home just in time, probably for the 2nd quarter. So don't worry about that. We'll be good as far as that's concerned, too. So this story, which captured my interest almost immediately, is on one level a story about the relocation of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Gettysburg Address, and a handful of other documents to Fort Knox on December 26, 1941, because of fears in the United States of an attack on Washington, D.C. in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. So bombing attacks, sabotage attacks, and the likes were huge fears among government officials, FDR, Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish, the Secret Service. Everybody had these real fears that these original documents could be in danger, and that would be just a disaster, both for the history of the country and as a psychic blow to the people of the country during the time. So that happens on December 26th, thinking about that. And what that does is it launches the largest, most secret relocation of American documents in history for safekeeping purposes. Over the next several months, 5,000 boxes of documents are moved from the Library of Congress to different inland university repositories to get them out of the way of potential Nazi bombers, potential saboteurs, that kind of thing. And we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that. But the other piece of this story, and this book is written in what editors and publishers call a braided narrative, right? So it goes back and forth from the 40s to different parts in American history. Because I thought as I was studying this initial story and doing the research for the initial story, I had to find out why people considered these documents so important. I mean, I knew why they were important, but what is the basis for these documents? Why do Americans cherish them so much, value them so much? And what other times in history did they save them? Did they try to rescue them? The actual parchments themselves, the ideas contained in those parchments, you name it. So the narrative takes you back to I go back to 1776, the creation of the Declaration of Independence, right in the late spring and early summer of 76, and probably the four most momentous days in American history, July 1 through 4, when independence is debated, voted upon on July 2nd, not July 4th, but July 2nd. John Adams said after it was voted upon on July 2nd, that July 2nd heretofore would be a day of great celebration in American history with bands and illuminations and fireworks and all kinds of celebration. It was 2 days off, but that happens on July 2nd. July 3rd, of course, when Jefferson's Declaration is reviewed and kind of edited, and July 4th when it's adopted. Very quick kind of review. I'm in the public relations business. It takes much longer to get like a press release out, but the Declaration is adopted on July 4th in 1776, so I go back and do that. I take you back to 1787, when the Constitution is adopted in Philadelphia, that hot, steamy summer of 1787, when all those principles of the Declaration are codified into law. Lincoln at one point said later on, the Declaration is the end, the Constitution is the means. So this whole notion of the principles in the Declaration that we'll talk about was codified in 1787. Almost doesn't happen. The convention almost disbands. I talked about that. So you'll see that in this book. I take you back to 1814, when the British invade and burn Washington. Burn the White House, burn the Capitol, burn many buildings in Washington, D.C. When the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, those original engrossed copies, are rescued by a clerk by the name of Stephen Pleasanton, clerk for the State Department, who has possession of them at that time. He stuffs them into a linen sack and takes them out by wagon to a farmhouse in Leesburg, Virginia, to keep them safe. Literally saves them. Dolly Madison also saves a trove of documents from the White House. She's at the White House until the very last minute in 1814. President James Madison is in the field on horseback with his men. Dolly stays until the last minute and with a couple of aides, loads those documents onto a wagon and saves them just before the White House is burned. Terribly burned. They would have all been destroyed. And among them were James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Our best accounting of the Constitutional Convention, by far. I thought how ironic it was as I was reviewing those notes that I wouldn't have been able to do that. Probably wouldn't have been able to write this book if not for Dolly Madison's efforts in 1814. So you'll read about that in this book. I take you back to 1823, when Washington, D.C. engraver William Stone produces the first exact facsimile replica of the Declaration of Independence, and that is the engrossed copy. When I say engrossed, right, the calligraphied copy with flourishes and curlicues and a style all its own by calligrapher and engrosser Timothy Matlock. William Stone takes 3 years to reproduce that, signatures and all. And that is the document that most Americans are familiar with, that maybe could be hung in a schoolhouse, a government building, in your home. For me personally, it was in my parents' home, and we sold my parents' home just a couple of years ago. And when we were doing the clean out, my mom's in an assisted living facility, my dad has passed. When we were doing the clean out, the very last thing that I took off the wall, high up on the wall in the basement, little playroom in the basement, was a copy of the Declaration of Independence, that engrossed copy that my parents had bought in 1976 at the bicentennial. So, as millions of Americans did. That facsimile was from William Stone's 1823 efforts. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams at the time commissioned him to do that. I take you back to 1826. America's Golden Jubilee on July 4th, 1826, 50 years since the Declaration of Independence was adopted. huge celebration, this huge kind of rebirth in patriotism, an interest in the founders after the War of 1812, after Stone's replica comes out. So it's a big celebration. But the day is elevated to almost a religious status on July 4th, 1826, when two of the most important founders die on the same day, July 4th, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, hours apart. From that point on, July 4th, the gravitas of that holiday is elevated for Americans. To this point, it's a huge, enormous holiday. It starts in 1826. By the way, that's not the only kind of great moment on July 4th. On July 4th, 1831, just 5 years later, James Monroe, former president and Revolutionary War hero, dies on July 4th, 1831. Yes, it's true. So that July 4th piece is a part of this story. I take you back to 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln is delivering a 2.5-minute speech at a small central Pennsylvania crossroads town called Gettysburg. He's dedicating the Union Cemetery, where he broadens the definition of all men are created equal, broadens the definition of we the people in the Constitution. We'll talk a little bit about that. I take you back to 1876, America's centennial celebration in Philadelphia, where there's real concern about the physical condition of the engrossed Declaration. It's deteriorating. Real concern is expressed at that time. Then I move you into the 20th century and talk to you about how the State Department sends those documents over to the Library of Congress, how they are moved to Fort Knox during World War II, and finally in 1952, how these original documents are moved to where they are today, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., in the Rotunda, which if you haven't gone down there and see them, you probably should. It's really a fantastic take. So, I had a perceptive editor say to me once about these incredible documents, the big three particularly. America has no crown jewels, he said, but if she did, it would be these documents. Think about this. Ours is the first constitutional republic that can trace its founding back to a single document. That's the Declaration of Independence. And I would argue that the principles of our democracy, the principles of our constitutional republic, rest on a single paragraph. And I think it's the most important paragraph in all of American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. There it is. It's Jefferson's iconic second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Worth going home and reading. It's a fantastic paragraph. And in that paragraph, he defines the principles of our democracy. He defines the sanctity of the individual. He defines our natural rights that nobody can take away. And he defines the relationship between people and government. That is, people provide government with the power, not the other way around. Now, make no mistake about it, guys. These were unheard of concepts in 1776. These were, go ahead, say it, revolutionary concepts in 1776. This was an era of monarchs, kings and queens, who ruled by fiat. And everyone else, just about everyone else, did what they were told. So Jefferson's words are stunning. They reverberate across the colonies. They reverberate around the world. And he knew he had to do it this way. He knew it. Adams knew it. Franklin knew it. He had to call them these kind of universal truths. If Jefferson had just written a document that expressed grievances against the crown, which, by the way, that's the second half of the Declaration, right? But if he had just done that, the Europeans in particular would want no part of accepting this new nation. They would have viewed it as kind of an internal squabble within the English Empire. They would have viewed it as almost a treasonous act, which it kind of was, but the Europeans would have not wanted to get involved in it. Jefferson needs to elevate and talk about these principles to make this declaration resound across the world. And it certainly does. And as a matter of fact, the delegates knew he was the person to write it. At the beginning, when they're considering who's going to do the writing, it came down basically to Jefferson and Adams. Adams said, I think you should do it. This is Adams' recollection. Jefferson has a slightly different one. But Adams' recollection, my favorite story, is that he says, I think you should do it, to Jefferson. Jefferson says, why? Adams says, well, number one, you're a Virginian. I'm from Massachusetts. We're considered much more radical in Massachusetts. Probably won't go over as well with the delegates. So if you write, it's got a little more gravitas. It's got a little more credibility. It'll probably appeal to more of the delegates. That's one. Number two, Adams says in that same vein, I am more obnoxious than you. He, quote unquote, to Jefferson, I am more obnoxious than you. You're well liked here. If I write this, if I write something like this, it's probably not going to go over. And number three, the most important reason, Adams recognizes this, he's very self-aware. He says to Jefferson, you are 10 times the writer I am. And Jefferson does not disappoint. From his quill flows those magical words, those important words, those words that are with us today, that almost everything we do in our government, almost everything we do, even in our culture, kind of rests on those words. It doesn't mean that we always get it 100% right, but it's part of our aspirations and our expectations. It's part of the discussion, all men are created equal. It's part of the discussion, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's part of the discussion that the people hold the power over the government. That's always part and parcel of what we do. That's a concept that begins here in 1776. It's not that the concepts of liberty and freedom were brand new in 1776, but a nation conceived in liberty certainly was brand new. So that's the Declaration of Independence. 11 years later in the Constitution, those principles are codified into law in a very short document. Pick up a copy of the Constitution. It's tiny. It's little. You can put it in your pocket. But it is a brilliant document. And when Gouverneur Morris, his first name Gouverneur, very strange name. Some people think it's Governor Morris of Pennsylvania. It is not. That's his name, Gouverneur Morris. We get the pronunciation from Abigail Adams, who kind of used to write phonetically. Historians still debate the pronunciation, but I think hers is probably as close as we're going to get. Gouverneur Morris writes the brilliant preamble, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings, capital B, of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. He talks about we the people. He talks about the blessings of liberty. And during the discussion of the presidency in the Constitution, which I think is kind of appropriate for this time of year as well, during the discussion of the presidency, it's Morris who makes the point. Morris that makes the point that even though these are three co-equal branches of government, that the power rests, most of the power in this document should rest with the Congress. Why? Because they are closest to the people. Get a look at the engrossed Constitution. You don't even have to read it. Get a look at it. It's 4 leaves. Article 1, which is the Congress, that leave goes for 1 3/4 leaves. Article 2 is shorter. Article 3 is of the judiciary is very short, and then there's 4, 5, and 6 tiny. So you just get this visual look of the Constitution, and you realize Morris is right. And Morris says, as they're debating the power of the presidency, Morris says what? He says, this chief executive is not the king in this government. He is more like the prime minister. The people are the king. Hence that power given to Congress. So he brings up that whole point of the people conveying the power to the government. 76 years later after that, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln is delivering that 2.5-minute address. My presentation to you, by the way, is about 20 times longer than the Gettysburg Address. And I am really upset that these words are not going to last nearly as long. But it's an amazing oration. It's an amazing oration. Lincoln, at first, isn't even sure he's going to speak. We'll talk about that in a second. But he says, 77 years ago, our fathers set forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now, he's in the middle of a civil war, basically about slavery. So he knows that needs to be broadened. Hence, the dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he says to this group, after he says that these men have died so that a nation may live, he implores the audience, implores them to resolve, right, that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. What is Lincoln saying? What is he knowing? He knows things need to be changed. But he's also saying he was a huge fan of the Declaration, a huge fan of the Constitution, a huge fan of the Founding Fathers in general. He's also saying that it's these documents that hold the key to binding the nation's wounds, to getting rid of the scourge of slavery. That all men created equal, it's already in the Declaration. We just need to broaden the definition of it. So it's not a scrapped declaration, but a new interpretation of the Declaration that allows us to do that. It's not a scrapped Constitution, but an amended one. The framers gave us the power to amend the Constitution, hence the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery. And then after that, the 14th and 15th, the Reconstruction Amendments that said children of slaves born here would be citizens, and the 15th Amendment that gave black men the right to vote. We don't expand it further until a little bit later for the ladies. But an amended Constitution was the answer, Lincoln said. So these documents really hold the key to the entire American experience. That's why FDR was concerned about them in 1941. That's why Archibald MacLeish, the Librarian of Congress, was concerned about them. That's why Harry Neal, who was the Secret Service agent that got them to the train that took them off to Fort Knox, was concerned about them. That's why these guys were awake for days before the effort. A couple other reasons, too. Think about this. These documents, and hence this country, because these documents, the history of these documents is the history of the country, was never preordained, never predestined, never a foregone conclusion. In 1776, there were lots of people that didn't want to break from the crown. There were lots of delegates in Philadelphia that didn't want to break from the crown, and certainly didn't want to declare independence at that moment. John Livingston of Pennsylvania said, to do this now would be like tearing down our own house before we had another place to live, and then asking our neighbor to take us in. To do it now would be like braving the storm in a skiff made of paper. So there was lots of debate. Not to mention the fact that we had to win a war that would last for several more years for this declaration to have any teeth at all. When that document is printed on the night of July 4th, first set in hot type at John Dunlap's print shop. By the way, Southborough has a copy of the Declaration. The Southborough Historical Society has a copy of the Dunlap broadside, Declaration of Independence. So first it's set in type. And then later it's engrossed. And the document is basically signed by all delegates, few exceptions, but almost everybody, on August 2nd, 1776. A momentous day. Delegates come to Independence Hall, called the Pennsylvania State House at that point, but Independence Hall. They kind of recognize the solemnity of the moment. As they step up to sign, they know that once they sign, right, they have a target on their back. They are guilty of treason. The potential for them to be hanged if the war is lost is very, very real. And even if the war is won, in the interim, they could be targeted in a greater way by the redcoats, the regulars. But they step up and they sign to very great risk to themselves. One of my favorite quotes from signing day is Rhode Island delegate Stephen Hopkins, 69 years old, one of the older delegates. Had a little touch of Parkinson's, had a palsy at the time that gave him kind of a shaky signature. If you look at the engrossed copy of the Declaration, look at one of those replicas, you'll see his signature is kind of shaky. And he says as he stepped up to sign, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not." Really amazing kind of risk when you think about it. But the document almost doesn't happen. It's not a foregone conclusion. During the Constitutional Convention, there is an enormous debate. The convention almost disbands. The large state representatives, the delegates from the large states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, right? New York, Madison, Hamilton, among them, they want representation in Congress to be based solely on population, right? Proportional representation. The delegates from the small states, at that time New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Connecticut, said, we're not doing that. You'll steamroll us. We want equal representation. We want equal representation to maintain the power and the sovereignty of the states. Are you kidding? We fear a strong central government. We just get done with that. What are you nationalists talking about? James Madison, what are you guys talking about? They come to real loggerheads. The debate is acrimonious. It's bitter. William Paterson in New Jersey says, New Jersey will never approve this plan. She will be swallowed up. Gunning Bedford from Delaware says to Madison and some of the other large state guys, I do not, gentlemen, trust you. He did call them gentlemen, but didn't trust them. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, right on the eve of the 4th of July in 1787, says, we are now at a full stop. We are at a full stop. They break for the 4th of July, the delegates do. And they watch the celebration, the 1787 celebrations of the 4th of July in Philadelphia 11 years later. So the 12th, 4th of July, if you will. They come back with this renewed purpose and basically say, we got to get this done. We got to figure it out. And so on July 16th, they come up, probably the most important day in the whole Constitutional Convention, they come up with what we know today as the Grand Compromise. What is it? In the lower house, the House of Representatives, representation would be by population, proportional representation. In the upper house, which we are going to call the Senate, equal representation. Each state would have 2. Nobody was entirely happy with this. Madison was furious. Smaller state folks said still too much power given in this one house, but they agree. That's the compromise. That's what we have today. But it almost falls apart. It comes this close to falling apart. So think about this, not a foregone conclusion. Even the Gettysburg Address. As I said, Lincoln almost doesn't go. He's not the main speaker. The main speaker is Edward Everett from Massachusetts, who gives a 2-hour oration. Lincoln is asked to say a few words as the President of the United States. He's thinking almost he's not going to go. Stanton says, I don't know if the schedule allows for it. There's all kinds of back and forth. Finally decides to go. Not to mention the fact that a war had to be won to make that document have any teeth. Now, by November of '63, it's unlikely the Union's going to lose after Gettysburg and after Vicksburg, but it's still a possibility. So think about it. The Declaration here, the Gettysburg Address here, both required wars to be won. Lots of fighting after both documents. And the Constitution requires a monumental compromise, give and take, between people who really, really couldn't stand each other's positions. And there's one more reason these documents are so important in 1941 and throughout our history, is think about this. These documents are not just artifacts, though they are artifacts. You go down to the National Archives, they're in completely dust-proof, humidity-proof, temperature-proof cases. They have computer systems that can monitor the Declaration and the Constitution inch by inch for deterioration. So they are artifacts. They're not just artifacts. Nor are they just symbols, but they are symbols. Go down to the National Archives and see these documents. They are in the rotunda. The lights are low. The footfalls on the floor are soft. The guards are standing guard at these documents. They are real symbols of our national identity. And they're not just day-to-day blueprints for running our government, as I said. The principles contained in that iconic second paragraph, part of our discussions. The Constitution, part of our discussions, every time a commentator says, will the Supreme Court find this law constitutional or unconstitutional? Who will control the Senate in the next election? Does Congress have the votes to override the presidential veto? Every single day, the Constitution is a living part of our life. So it's not any one of those, it's all three of those. Those documents are artifacts, they are symbols, and they are daily blueprints. So all of that is what's on the table during the Second World War. Archibald MacLeish said as they're planning this massive relocation, but these three documents, the most important, it kept him awake for days on end. Later on he said it was a terrifying responsibility to have to be in charge of moving the original Declaration and the original Constitution out of the Library of Congress. He gets the okay to put them in Fort Knox. But Fort Knox doesn't have enough space for all the documents that have to be moved. Because there's a lot of gold in Fort Knox at the time, in that gold bullion depository. He gets about 60 cubic feet of space, about the size of a freezer, horizontal freezer, to put the Declaration in and the Constitution in. He also the Gettysburg Address, but also Lincoln's second inaugural goes into Fort Knox. The Articles of Confederation go into Fort Knox. The Magna Carta from 1215, Britain had sent it over to the 1939 World's Fair to be on display. When war breaks out in Europe, the Brits, who lost a tremendous amount of documents during the Blitz particularly, but through the Nazi firebombings, asked us to hold on to that document. Library of Congress had it. MacLeish decides it's part of the documents that have to be moved. Makes some kind of joke about the Magna Carta being right next to the Declaration of Independence. He said Jefferson would have found a certain irony in it, but enjoyed it, that they were together. Doesn't even tell the British ambassador where it is. Just says it's in a safe place. It was all done in complete secrecy. And over the next several months, those 5,000 boxes of other documents are moved. And what are they? They are Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention, the journals of the Continental Congress from 1776, the presidential papers, Washington's diaries, Samuel Morse's first telegraph message in 1844, "What hath God wrought?" The original goes to a different location. They go to university locations, 3 of them. The University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, and Denison University in Granville, Ohio. All inland, all having some mountains to protect them from bombers, and all fulfilling, after about 60 visits to places around that eastern, just over the Alleghenies and the Smoky Mountains, all being waterproof, basically, dust-proof, mite-proof, vermin-proof, you need it, you name it. All of that went into the decision of how to move these documents. And it's all done in complete secrecy. Americans had no idea that these documents were being moved. And the reasons they're moved in Washington, D.C. is there's this real palpable fear of attack. These were not whimsical decisions that Roosevelt made lightly, that McLeish made likely, that the military and the Secret Service made likely. Think about this. After Pearl Harbor, the White House goes dark on December 9th. No more lights. Gun emplacements on the roof around Washington. Sentries at the War Department around Washington. There was even discussions about painting the White House black right after Pearl Harbor. That doesn't happen, but the windows are painted black. The Oval Office is fitted with bulletproof glass. The White House staff is given gas masks by the Secret Service. FDR kept his on his wheelchair, hung it on his wheelchair arm. The Secret Service builds a tunnel, a zigzag tunnel, 750 feet long, from underneath the White House to into the Treasury nearby, into the Treasury Department cellar. So Roosevelt, if he had to, could escape down there. It had food, it had water, it had bathroom facilities, it had office space. FDR said to Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, "Henry, I'm never going down there unless I can play poker with all the gold in your vaults." And he never does go down there. The Secret Service, by the way, still does not release photographs of that tunnel. I worked with the Secret Service archivist on this book. When it came, I obviously wanted to include a photo of the tunnel, and those photos are not released even today. So I don't know what the status of the tunnel is. I don't know what else is down there. I don't know anything beyond that. But that's happening. That's happening. Roosevelt says in February of 1942 at a press conference, the Germans can probably come in and bomb Washington, D.C. and New York City tonight. And under certain circumstances, they can probably even get to Detroit and bomb Detroit tonight. So there is this tremendous fear of attack. The other thing Roosevelt knows that other Americans don't know, except those living along the coast, is German U-boats are sinking merchant ships up and down the East Coast with impunity. For the first 6 months of 1942, it's a disaster. America has almost no Navy after Pearl Harbor. It's got ships in the Pacific, some, but in the Atlantic, there's almost nothing guarding the East Coast. So German U-boats are sinking ships off Cape Cod, off Cape May, off Cape Hatteras, off Virginia Beach, off the Outer Banks, off Jacksonville, Florida, with impunity, as I said. FDR is well aware of this. So this fear of attack on Washington, D.C. is very, very real. There's even discussions about rerouting the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Because where they meet, pilots could get a perfect fix on the White House. White House is about a mile straight down from where they meet. So there's very real discussions about rerouting those two rivers. So very important to keep that in mind, that when these documents are moved, this very real fear is underway. Archibald McLeish said the reason we are doing this is to preserve our national treasures and preserve our national morale. Knew it would be devastating if these documents were destroyed. They stay hidden. They stay hidden until September of 1944. There's one little exception I'm going to tell you about, but for the most part, they stay hidden in Fort Knox, in those university repositories until September of 44. This is a few months after D-Day. Allies are sort of on their way to Berlin. The Russians are on their way to Berlin. There's really not too much fear about an attack on the American mainland at that point. McLeish says the military officials are now saying you can bring those documents back over the Smoky Mountains and back over the Alleghenies and back to the Library of Congress. And they do. But that one exception, on April 13th, 1943, so a year plus before that, the Jefferson Memorial is dedicated at the Tidal Basin in Washington, D.C. And FDR thinks it would be a good idea if the original engrossed declaration were put on display. There's that symbol again. Thought it would be good for morale. In 1943, Americans were kind of bogged down. The war had been going on, since Pearl Harbor, and no end in sight for the most part. So he thought it would be a good idea during the dedication to bring out the original declaration. And it is out there for 1 week, guarded by Marine Guard, heavily guarded by Marines. And then it's put back into Fort Knox. Now, no American knew where it came from, and no Americans knew where it was going back to. That was in 44. One more point, and then I will open up to your questions. 1952. Big monumental day, December 13th, 1952. A big parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. Military bands, military vehicles, military personnel. As the original Declaration and the original Constitution were being transferred from the Library of Congress to the National Archives, their permanent home at the Rotunda, so that every American could go see them. There's lots of turf fighting and infighting and turf battles between the Library of Congress and the National Archives. I detail some of it in the book. It's kind of interesting. But finally, the Librarian of Congress and the Archivist of the United States get together and agree this should be in the archives. Some of the staff members of the Library of Congress were furious. They were losing their most prestigious documents. Some said, we will never, ever have the level of prestige that we have on this day. And on December 15th, Bill of Rights Day, President Harry Truman presides over a ceremony enshrining these documents permanently at the National Archives, one of Truman's last public events. Eisenhower was elected in November of 52. Truman is in December before he leaves office, presides over the ceremony. And Truman says to the audience assembled that if we only allow these documents to be physically enshrined, they will die. They need to be enshrined in our hearts and in our minds. He said to the group, this generation, the generation in front of him, and future generations, that would be us, are stewards of these documents, stewards of the ideas that are contained in them, stewards of the freedom and liberties that we enjoy today. So I think the 1 million people that go visit the Declaration, the Constitution, every year, I think they get all this. I think they recognize these documents as the symbols that they are, as the artifacts that they are, as the day-to-day documents that they are, that we govern with, and as the documents that are the foundation of our history, our liberty, our equality. They are the mirrors, I think, these documents, the mirrors to our national heritage. That's what they are. For 240 years, this is the 240th anniversary of the first of those, 1776. People have guarded them and preserved them well. I think that responsibility now falls to us. So let's make sure we get it right. Thank you very much. We'll get to questions. Any questions? And you can ask anything, writing, research, publishing, we'll go to you first, and then because Hal, I talked to you earlier, you're second.
How did you happen upon this story? Because it's not very common knowledge. I never read about it in the history books.
Yeah.
How did you happen?
Yeah, how did I happen upon the story? It's not common knowledge. It's funny you say that because when I was doing the Library of Congress research, Library of Congress has a lot of primary source documents on this. And one of the researchers down there said to me, you know, like only 2 people have ever looked at this. You know, like it's very unusual. So it was cool. I knew no one was stealing the idea at that point. But no, I had read a small item in a magazine, and this was probably back in 2009. I mean, I've written a couple of books while this was banging around in my head, about the documents moving to Fort Knox. And I kind of consider myself a little bit of a World War II expert. I had never heard of that. And including some of the home front stuff. I feel like I know a lot about that era. Had never heard of it. And it was a little paragraph. Oh, when these documents were moved to Fort Knox, I said, wow, I gotta look into that. So I just, you know, just like a big ball of yarn, and I just kind of pulled on it. And
What's the paragraph and what?
I can't remember, are you asking me what publication it was in? Yeah, I don't know if it was American History Magazine. You know, I can't remember the actual magazine. I just saw the reference to it. I said, whoa, I didn't know that. And then, let me see if there's more here. So, and there was a lot there. So it was cool. Yeah. There's there's often no magic to that. You know, like people will say, how do you get those ideas? And sometimes it's just saying, wow, that makes me curious, you know? So, yeah.
Was there any concern in the Civil War about the South invading Russia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Was there any concern about the Civil War, during the Civil War, about the South invading and these documents being in jeopardy? No, which is interesting. Lots of concern about Washington falling, yes. Yes, as a matter of fact, the Massachusetts 5th is the first division down there to protect this absolutely undefended Washington. And Lincoln actually meets them and says, New York's nowhere to be found. Rhode Island is late getting here. You are the one true North, he says to those guys. But no, there's almost nothing about these documents in the Library of Congress. Nothing like, for example, in 1814, you know, when there was real fears of the British invading. Although Stephen Pleasanton, who's the clerk that moves the documents in 1814, defies the Secretary of War, who says, you don't need to move those documents. The British are never getting as far as Washington. They have no desire to come to Washington. They are after Baltimore. Baltimore's far more strategic, and it was. But he kind of missed it, the Secretary of War. He missed the whole symbolism thing of maybe they could have taken Madison prisoner. Maybe they could have taken Dolly prisoner. You know, he kind of missed that, and they come there. But no, there's almost no mention of it during the Civil War, which is a great question. Yes?
So I hope the answer is yes. Do you get invited to speak to any classes in high school?
I do. I speak at lots of high school classes and college. I do a lot of speaking at high schools and college. Yeah, I do. Yeah, thanks.
I mean, I was a history teacher. I'm not doing that particular thing anymore, but I just find the level of, the word that comes to mind is ignorance about the documents and about the way the government was formed and why it is, and people make up their own versions of the Bill of Rights. And
Yeah.
so I'm glad that you're...
Yeah, I have my own, I'm a little bit of an evangelist when it comes to this topic, so don't get me going. I want to get you home for the Jacoby Brissett era. But I think, and I talk to a lot of history teachers too. And you know, my wife was a teacher for 30 years. She's a principal now. And I love teachers, but history is one of those subjects that is not often taught well. Not often. There are great teachers, but it's not often taught well, and it's often because I think a lot of teachers miss the second part of that word, which is story. So those stories often get lost. I spoke to my wife's 5th grade class. She taught 5th grade. And so when you're the husband of a 5th grade teacher, you get called in a lot, you know, for pro bono work. So I went in to do a thing on Lincoln one time. It was around President's Day. She said, come on and do a thing on Lincoln. And you know, so I kind of started off with the kids and say, all right, tell me everything you know about Lincoln. I'm going to write it up on the whiteboard. It was a blackboard at that point, I think. And so they tell me, he freed the slaves, he's tall, he wore a hat, he was assassinated, everything you can imagine. So I said, okay, you guys are 10 years old, imagine this. And kids can handle this. Imagine you're in the White House, you're the President of the United States, you're managing a war because your generals are incompetent at this point in the war, and your 9-year-old son dies. He's 1 year younger than you. What do you think that would be like? So the kids, they're good. They can handle that. We talk it through. So anyways, a few days later, I get a, like a stack of thank you notes that the kids send on construction paper with crayons and stuff, like, pictures of Lincoln in his top hat. Thank you, Mr. Puleo. And one girl writes to me, and I said to my wife, Kate, this girl is going to be a Rhodes Scholar. She writes, dear Mr. Puleo, thank you for coming in to talk to us about Abraham Lincoln. I really enjoyed it. But I want you to know, I enjoyed the personal parts more than I enjoyed the history parts. And I said to Kate, of course, the personal parts are the history parts, right? That's the whole point. So this girl is going to be a Rhodes Scholar. I did lose track of her, by the way. Don't ask me, did she become one? But I just thought she hit it, man. She didn't quite know what she was hitting, but she hit it right on the nose. So when I tell history teachers that, I tell them one other story, if you'll bear with me. So Teddy Roosevelt, I'm a big fan of TR. And one day, I had all of these three big publishers, McDougall Littell, Houghton Mifflin, I forget who the third is, that do these textbooks. And they said, would you mind looking at this history textbook and the teacher version of the history textbook, and tell us what you think? I said, okay, well, I can do that. So I was very diligent, So we're in a room, it's me and about 25 people around this big conference table, all representing the publishing community. They said, what do you think? I said, well, these textbooks don't quite get it done. Well, can you give us an example? I said, yes, they're all these really kind of soft narratives of, chronological like this, and they kind of go like that. Very soft waves, just kind of lapping the shore. And I go, there's nothing that really grabs these kids or teachers by the lapels and says, hey, we're talking about Lincoln now. You need to know, kids, why every 25 years, 200 books come out on Abraham Lincoln. Okay, you need to know that. You need to know that there's more written about Abraham Lincoln than anybody in history with the exception of Jesus Christ and the Kennedy assassination. You need to know that. And here's why. So it's like the Gadsden purchase gets like the same soft treatment as Lincoln. Okay, there's nothing wrong with the Gadsden purchase. It's a fine purchase. But, there's nothing that kind of says, do this. And I said, let me give you the example, my TR example. You get to Teddy Roosevelt, and it's Rough Riders, San Juan Hill, environmentalist, president, all of that. I said, but in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, after he was president, is running as a member of the Bull Moose Party against John Taft and Woodrow Wilson, probably cost Taft the election. And while he's campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he's got a big speech, a sheaf of papers in his breast pocket. While he's campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, an assassin shoots him. Bullet goes through the sheaf of papers, lodges in Teddy's chest. His entourage and doctor wants to take him to the hospital. He said, no, I have a speech to give. Goes into the arena in Milwaukee. There are 5,000 people present. Of course, no microphone. It's like this. He's talking like I am. And he says to the group, I'd ask you to all keep your side conversations to a minimum. I have just been shot. And my voice is not as strong as it normally is. Teddy proceeds to give a 1-hour speech, discarding one bloodstained page after another, because it's right, it goes right through there. And then he says to his doctor, okay, I'll go to the hospital now. Goes to the hospital, they find out that the bullet is wedged into his chest muscles. Teddy loved the fact that he prided himself on his working out and they leave it. They say, we're not touching it. And then, Teddy dies of natural causes 9 years later, something like that. But I say to the textbook publishers in the room, who makes the decision to leave that story out of the book? That story's not, had you guys known that story? No.
I think it was in the Ken Burns.
Yeah, yes, oh no,
So
it's,
I saw that's
sure,
why, but I would
right,
never have known that.
right. So I said, who makes the decision to leave those stories out? So they're all kind of a little sheepish at this point, because I'm practically on top of the table, so I'm trying to control myself. And one of the guys, and believe me, these are not dumb people. These are very smart people, these publishers. I don't mean to imply otherwise. But one of them raises their hand and he says, look, you know what? More than any other topic, history, he says, look at the back of that book. There's like an advisory group board of like 110 people listed. He said, more than any other topic, history becomes influenced by politics. So you have conservatives and liberals. You have, rural people and city people. You just name the way it's broken out. And so he goes, like in that example that you just gave, there might be pro-gun people who wanted to play it up. There might be anti-gun people who didn't want to mention it. So pick any example you want, he said. We deal with that all the time. And so we have to kind of water this thing down to that very vanilla stuff you're talking about. He says, what you just did with the wave is perfect. He said, that's what we have to end up doing sometime. So I always tell teachers and kids, sure, use your textbook, it's fine. It's fine to kind of have some of the facts but make sure you read other stuff. Make sure you read other things. There's lots of great nonfiction out there, that's just wonderful. So make sure you do that. So anyway, that's the long answer to my, I'm sorry, did I go past my time?
Read the part that Texas left out.
Right.
Read the part what?
That Texas left out.
Well, Texas does it on one side and California does it on the other side. So it happens, but trust me, it happens on both sides of the aisle. And what's that?
Kids only get one version.
I'm just saying, subject matter wise, it's, the point he made was well taken. It doesn't happen with physics. It doesn't happen with French. You know what I mean? So but history has a political element to it that other books don't, other textbooks
I
don't.
just want to
So,
say one other thing, because there are people in this room who remember on Memorial Day, right, when we had a teacher named Mary Finn, who now has a school named after her. And
in this town?
Yes.
Oh.
On Memorial Day, there'd always be some fifth grader, I think, this is before Manchester, who recited the Gettysburg Address out here in front of where there's a piano.
Yeah, sure.
I'm not sure. Are they still doing that? It got to the point where they had memorized it. She made them memorize it.
Yeah.
You probably think that's anyway.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure they're still doing it anymore.
I use it when I sometimes use it as an example when I talk to people, because I do a lot of speech coaching in my other life. And I always say to folks, you don't need to speak for, an hour. I mean, just look like I just did, sorry. No, but you can look at what Lincoln did in less than 300 words. By the way, it's like 278 words. It's amazing. So trust me, I say, that 25 slides you have in that deck, no one's going to remember that next month. So think about that when you want to communicate, So, yeah, it's good. Yes, sir.
Can you give us about a paragraph about each of your other books?
Sure. The Caning is about the beating of Senator Charles Sumner on the floor of the U.S. Senate by Preston Brooks of South Carolina. And I kind of portray it as the no turning back point on the way to civil war. So it happens in May of 1856, May 22nd of 1856. Still 5 years until war happens, but it kind of makes compromise impossible. And that's that story. It's the first book I know on the subject. It's kind of written as a dual biography. In a sense, it tells you about Sumner and Brooks. Brooks, in most history books or in most other books, just gets a paragraph as the bully Brooks. So I kind of build both of their characters up and get to that point. So I really highly endorse that book. I'm not saying you have to buy it. I'm saying I love that book. Is it my favorite? I don't know about that. I love all of my books for different reasons, A City So Grand covers Boston from 1850 to 1900. So I portray it as the emergence of Boston from a large, influential town to a world-class city. And in between that is everything from it starts with the great abolitionist movement, goes through all of the technology stuff, the city with the first telegraph fire alarm system, the city with the first horse-drawn railroad, the arrival of the Irish, the filling of the Back Bay, all the way up to 1900s. I highly endorse that book too. Shoot, now that I think of it, yes. The Boston Italians is my one-volume story of the Italians in Boston. A real labor of love for me, my heritage, of course, and so it's the first that was done. So I really enjoy that. Due to Enemy Action is not here. It's a there's two books that aren't here. One is Dark Tide, the Molasses Flood book. Ryan, I'm not sure why Ryan didn't have it here, but he doesn't. So that was my first book, and I love that book. And Due to Enemy Action is my World War II story that right now is just an ebook. So we ended up, the book did come out with a publisher. We ended up, later on an ebook publisher made an offer on it, so it became an ebook. And I'm now trying to get the rights back because I want to bring it back out as a paperback. My agent does too. And it's about the sinking of one of the last American warships by a German U-boat on April 23rd, 1945. And the Navy, very, very late, 4 miles off the coast of Maine. And the Navy kind of covers up that story because they're really concerned that a U-boat got that close that late in the war. And for 60 years, the story was that a boiler explosion caused it. And they finally changed the story in 2002. And so 3 of the living survivors, they've passed now, but 3 of the living survivors I got very close with, and they're the main characters in that story. So I love that too. My dad's was a World War II veteran, and so that was very close to my heart too. So so there's 6 in total. And if you get a Puleo bookmark, where do I have them? Right here. You will never forget the names of them because, of course, here they are. So that's that. Who else? I'm going to this man first because you already had one. I'll be back to you. Yes, sir.
Steve, the research sounds like huge fun. How do you know when you've done enough? How do you stop and then turn it and start writing?
Yeah, no, it's the great nonfiction question, right? Because I tend to be an author who, different nonfiction people do this in different ways. I tend to be an author who does try to do almost all the research first before writing. Some people do it differently. So I would say that you build the story in your head, and so you have that saying, okay, I think I have enough. But then you also have the very realistic, there's a deadline coming and you have a contract to meet. So, oh my God, I got 9 months to write this now. So that is part of it. You need that. I need that because you're right. The research, I love the research, and you can always find another document, And sometimes, like anybody who's written, people who write tend to find excuses not to write. So anytime you can say, I think I want to just see if there's a few more documents. Let me just visit this archives. It's easier than writing. So you have to be aware of that. I'd say it's a struggle. But there's kind of a point I reach where I say, I think I got this. I think I know how the story's going to unfold. And there might be a time during the writing that something else turns up and you're like, whoa, this is good. I'll use that. But for the most part, I try to do it all first. There are nonfiction writers who don't like that because of that very reason. So they want to start writing while they're researching because of that issue, Yeah. So, yes, sir.
Do you currently have another idea for a book?
I do, but I will not be sharing it with you or anyone else. No. So there's only one person who knows it right now, and that's my wife. Not even my agent knows it. So I'm still in the kind of early stages. I kind of have a good feel, I think. I think I know where it's going. So
Give us a general topic.
narrative nonfiction. That's a general topic. Yeah, you're right. So, yeah, I'll just say it's narrative history. I got to leave it at that. But I'll tell you this: if you're not on my mailing list, I mean this sincerely.
I'm not an author, so I'm not going to steal that.
No, that's fine. It's mostly not for that reason. It's mostly because until I sell the proposal, all it is an idea, right? So even keel until there's a deal, That's kind of my philosophy. So, but I'll tell you this, sign my little sheet up here, which just put your name and your email down. If you're not on my e-blast list, I do, and by the way, I do like 3 or 4 e-blasts a year, that's it. I had a woman at a presentation say the other night, I signed up for Williams Sonoma and I get something every day. Is that going to be you? No, that is not going to be me. So I don't want you to think that, but sign my sheet and you will be among the first several thousand people to know when it's time. Promise you that. Yes?
Our book club read Dark Tide and...
Thank your book club for me.
Yes.
Yes.
We all enjoyed it. How did you come about to write that? I mean, we all were kind of this news story too.
Yeah, so when I did my master's thesis, and it's on Italian immigration to the United States, and I used Boston as a focal point. So looked at hundreds of naturalization petitions and, doing all that. And so I came across the flood story then. Same thing. I said, oh, geez, I never heard about this. So the first thing I did was go look at some newspapers, and there were 7 Boston newspapers at the time, and they all covered the flood in a big way. The flood knocked off the front page the Treaty of Versailles and Prohibition at the time, which were both underway, being debated. And I'm like, wow, this is pretty amazing. But was wondering, are there primary sources? Because all my books use primary sources. When you read my bibliographic essay, which I expect you all to do tonight, American Treasures has a 30-page bibliographic essay, so please enjoy it. No, but I always use primary sources. When you write narrative history, you need to be on this really solid foundation of primary sources. So I wasn't sure if there were any. But then I found the judge in the case, the big class action lawsuit that follows, not to get into the story, but the judge in the case wrote a great summary. So I started with that. And then I had a great archivist who found for me the damage awards in the case, which are these, if you've never seen damage awards, are these individual stories for each of the people, each of the 119 people who were part of the suit. And that same archivist, I kept saying references to the 25,000 pages of testimony in the case. And I said to the archivist, I got to find this. We got to find this. And she said, well, don't get your hopes up. It might be lost to history, blah, blah, blah. And so one August, I remember it, one August morning, she called me and and archivists, by the way, and librarians, I've dealt with well over 100, I'd say, total. They're wonderful people. They'll do anything for you. They're very earnest. They'll do anything. Archivists, though, have, I think, a much more even keel because they find this eureka stuff all the time. So it's like nothing to them. So she calls me in a very low voice, says, the 25,000 pages of testimony I've been looking for in the molasses flood case? I said, yes. She said, I found it. So I kind of jump up and down, not so even keeled. And she said they're at the Social Law Library in Government Center, and they're expecting your call. So she kind of greased those skids a little bit for me, and I went in there and read. I read about probably 20,000 pages of the testimony. And so a lot of that book, even though part 3 of that book is the court case, right? Parts 1 and 2, I draw a lot from the testimony, that to do the narrative, Yeah. So, but thank your book club. Really appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. We're good? What time is it? Just out of curiosity. 10. That's not bad. You guys are like 5 minutes from here. Don't be giving me that look. If you want to buy books, feel free. If you do or don't, please sign the email. Thank you very much. You guys have been great.